It is hard for me to convey the loathing and the revulsion that ordinary people will feel for what you have done. Your crimes must rank amongst the most evil and horrific acts that any human being could commit. I am taking into consideration any risk that you may pose to the public in the future. You have shown yourself to be an unfit human being, unfit to live in a decent society. Welcome to the Extraordinary Stories podcast. Hi, hello, welcome, how are you? Are you well? Are you good? I am. Thanks for joining me on this new episode of Extraordinary Stories. Couple of quick thank yous to say to begin with, and then we'll just get on with the story. I'd like to say thanks to Hallie for your email and for the Twitter support. That's been lovely. Hello and welcome to new listeners as well. Welcome along. Thank you for the feedback. This week's story is one of murder, intrigue, and it's a story which spans decades and is still being investigated. Okay, let's go. When you hear the name Bible John, in the same breath you will hear three other things: the Barrowland killings, unsolved murders, and the name Peter Tobin. Now we'll get to him a little bit later. Now all three of these things, I'll do my best to break them down as we go through a case which for many people it's still as alive as it was in the 1960s when the very first part of this event happened. In a way, this is almost two extraordinary stories altogether. One leads directly right into the next, so I'll do my best to keep the story on track and join those two things together. So let's set the scene. It's the 1960s and we're in Glasgow. Now, it was a city full of dance halls. So, dance halls were party places for people to go at the weekend. So as well as pubs, you had these dance halls which were big, large spaces. Usually there was live music, there was a lot of alcohol. They're just a precursor really to the clubs that we know now. So I mean, these are the kind of places my grandparents would definitely have gone to at the time. If any of you have grandparents who during the 1960s were young things, they would certainly have been going there as well. One of the most popular places was the Barrowlands Ballroom. That was a very popular place to go in the 60s. There's a great image in my mum's house of my gran, and she's all sort of dolled up. And this is sort of, I would say it's 67, 68. She's all dolled up for a night out. It's one of those like old cracked black and white photographs, which, you know, like these days, they're just so precious. Those photographs, we're so used to everything on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, and we have all these lovely digital images, but those photographs I think are just wonderful. Anyway, she looks incredible, and I've no doubt at that point she would have been going out to one of the famous Glasgow dance halls. So the Barrowlands Ballroom was in the East End of Glasgow, a 5-minute walk really from the city centre, not far. It was the beating heart of Glasgow nightlife at the time. A quick history of the Barrowlands. They were built in the 1930s, first of all as a ballroom, but also as a street market. So you have this big, beautiful venue space where all these dances took place, but around that you have lots of little shops, stalls, little areas that pop up selling everything and anything. It serves as a music venue now in Glasgow, and it's one of these like really cool ones. It's like, yeah, that band, yeah, they only play places like the Barrowlands. So people who've played there are like Oasis, U2, The Clash, The Smiths. Years ago when Prince came to Glasgow, he did like a big arena concert. He played his main show in one of Glasgow's biggest arenas, and then he did like a secret late night set at 3 a.m. in the Barrowlands. Arcade Fire played there a few years ago. It's said to be one of the top 20 best music venues in Europe. And it is a cool venue. It is actually really great, the Barrowlands. It has this absolutely massive, large neon sign right out the front of it. It's a really sort of iconic image of Glasgow now. It just says Barrowlands. And apparently it's one of the largest neon signs ever made in the UK. Little known fact for you there. So as well as being this sort of venue, there's also a market around it, and the market still exists. You can go to it whenever you want. It sells everything and anything. If you were looking for antiques, carpets, clothing, music, whatever you wanted, things for your dog, things for your cat, trainers, yeah, the Barras is the place to go to get that if you want. Sorry, I've just realised I keep slipping into calling it the Barras, but the Barrowlands is its full name, but in Glasgow it gets shortened to the Barras, so if I slip into calling it, you'll know why. On a Sunday, this is an absolutely brilliant marketplace to go to. You can buy, yeah, like I said, you can buy lots and lots of things there. I'm not saying it's a dodgy place, but you could get yourself some knockoff Nike trainers if you wanted them. You can get yourself a wee Prada handbag if that was your thing, at a discount price. My favourite thing on a Sunday, because it just makes me laugh every time I go, is that there's a man who walks about and he doesn't have a stall and he doesn't have a shop. He just has a backpack. And this man must be about 105 years old. I'm not kidding, he's so old. And he just shouts this over and over and over. Get your tobacco. Get your Viagra. Get your tobacco. Get your Viagra. And that's all he sells. So from his little backpack, he's got these two. I mean, I would not trust either of the products that are coming out of his backpack. But, he's been there a long, long time. And so people who've been to the Barras for the first time will often go, oh my God, what about the guy that sells Viagra out of his backpack? Well, he's been there a long time. There's obviously a demand. So, anyway, let's go back to the 1960s. The ballroom was popular, it was thriving, it was busy, but that was about to change. The ballroom became famous for a very different reason. It became a place of terror and fear as there were 3 young females murdered, having spent the night at the Barrowlands ballroom. Each of the girls who died had been seen in the ballroom on a Saturday night, and by the Sunday morning would be dead. So it raises the question, was the killer of these women in the ballroom choosing victims? Was the killer blending into the party scene and choosing the next victims? Let's get to the deaths. Horrible, horrific as they are. So the first, on February the 23rd, 1968, the naked body of 25-year-old nurse Patricia Docker was found by a man on his way to work near the Barrowlands. She had been raped and she had been strangled. Now, the previous night, she told her parents that she was going out dancing at a nearby club, the Majestic Ballroom in Hope Street. So that's a whole different dance hall. That's where she told her parents that she was going. Patricia had in fact gone to the Barrowlands Ballroom for the over 25s night. So it was during this night in the Barrowlands that she met her killer. Patricia's handbag and clothes were missing, and despite months of investigation, they were never ever found. So because of the misinformation, because she had said she was going to another ballroom, police spent a long, long time investigating all the people who had been at the ballroom she said she was at and not the actual one that she was at. So this really hurt the investigation, as it took a lot of police time to figure out that actually she hadn't been where she said that she had been. So we skip forward to 15th of August 1969. So what's that? About a good year and a half later, mother of 3, Jemima MacDonald, was 32 years old, and she went for a night out in the Barrowlands ballroom, and the next day her sister Margaret didn't hear from her, and this was unusual. So Margaret began to go around to her flat, and there was no answer at the door, and she began to become worried and suspicious. And then around that area, Margaret heard rumours that there were young children seen leaving the building that her sister lived in, and they were talking about the body in the building. Now, didn't know what that meant, thought it was probably just kids having a laugh, talking about something silly, but as time passes, she began to get concerned that she hadn't heard from her sister. She'd last seen her on the Saturday night. We're now into like the Tuesday, and she's beginning to really panic. So she goes to the building again where her sister lives, and there she finds Jemima's body battered, lying in the hallway. It was partially hidden. So obviously the local kids had spotted this body, and rather than report it to police or tell their parents, they just got the rest of their pals round to see it. She had been strangled, raped and beaten to death. Witnesses said that they'd seen her leaving the club at midnight with a tall, slim young man with reddish hair. Police conducted door-to-door inquiries at the time and found a woman who seems to remember hearing screams coming from the building, but she didn't do anything about it, and she couldn't remember what time she'd heard those screams. Police thought this was of little use, this information, and the investigation wound down. It's really creepy to think that those kids were just going and looking at that dead body. I know kids get fascinated with really weird and really morbid things, but yeah, it's strange. Poor Jemima, her body was lying in that hallway of her building, the building she lived in the whole entire time. On to 31st of October 1969, so really not too long after Jemima had been killed. 29-year-old Helen Puttock was the third female to be found murdered. She had also been to the Barrowland ballrooms on that night. She'd gone there with her sister Jean, and they had met 2 men, both called John. A common name, John, in fact, isn't it? Yeah, well, one of my middle names is John, so yeah, so fairly common. John, Jack, that whole kind of idea. One of the Johns told Helen where he was from, but the other John, he wouldn't disclose where he was from. So they have a couple of hours in the ballroom. So Helen and Jean and the 2 Johns, one who would say where he's from and one who wouldn't, and they head home at this point. So Helen, the victim, her sister Jean, and the I'm not telling you where I'm from, John, all share a taxi. The other guy headed off home. He just went home. They head towards the west end of the city. In fact, the taxi destination where they go to is actually just 4 streets away from where I'm currently podcasting right now in my house. So I didn't even know that when I started this story. I started looking it up and I was like, hang on a minute. That street is really... Why does that sound familiar to me? And I was like, oh, it's 4 streets away from where I am now. Anyway, it was during this taxi journey that most of the crucial information about the killer came to light. So police at this point have decided we've got 2 deaths so far on our hands. They look like they've been done by the same person. So during this journey, a lot of interesting information arrives. Jean, the sister of Helen, the victim, told police that the John that they had in their taxi, he was a well-spoken man, and he quoted a lot from the Bible. So this is where the name Bible John comes from. The 3 of them, they chatted in the taxi. It was all quite fun. And Jean says, although she felt he was perhaps a little bit odd, and the quoting from the Bible thing was strange, she didn't necessarily feel creeped out. She felt like her sister would be quite safe with this man. She wasn't necessarily too alarmed. So they drop Jean off at her house, and Helen and John, I'm not telling you where I'm from, they go to Helen's house. The next morning, Helen's battered body was found in the back garden of her flat. She had been raped and strangled. The contents of her handbag had been scattered nearby, but the actual bag was missing. It's been suggested that the killer took this as a trophy. Grass stains on Helen's feet indicate that there had been a struggle in which Helen had probably tried to escape her killer. She also had a deep bite mark on her leg, semen on her clothing. But it was 1969. A bite mark on her leg and semen on her clothing, that was of no use to police. DNA testing was miles in the future. That was still to happen. So police couldn't really do much with that at the time. So now, there's 3 dead. Police believe this is the same person. The same man is doing this. So they become known as the Bible John murders. And the Bible John murders become Glasgow's longest running and most high profile unsolved crimes case. The mystery of Bible John had the city whispering and questioning, who could this man be? So, police take a record 50,000 statements. A photo fit of John is produced based largely on Jean, who'd seen him in the taxi before her sister died, and some ballroom guests who could remember a man who they thought was a little peculiar hanging around the ballroom, who they had maybe seen with this victim, or they'd maybe seen him with that person. There was something was coming together. There was a collective image of a man appearing. So the really iconic photo fit of Bible John, you should look it up. This was issued, and at the time there was a lot of men who could have fitted that photo fit at the same time, and these men, unfortunately, they were attacked in public. Now the police were actually forced to it's so silly, but they were actually forced to give out cards to men who looked a little like Bible John that said, "I am not Bible John," because these men were having to defend themselves. I suppose it's one of those things, isn't it, where it's like, you know, everyone would like to think they look really different. Everyone would like to think that we're all really individual. But essentially, you're always going to look a little bit like other people. So, especially if at the time, styling's the same, you're wearing similar styles of clothing, you happen to be roughly the same height, you're roughly the same colouring. Well, these things do happen. So, what a fucking nightmare for these men. I also wonder, what was the process of handing out these cards? Because police must surely have had to go, okay, before I hand you a card that says, "I am not Bible John," you must have to go through an interview process. You must have to be checked and vetted, which is, relatively a good thing actually, because it's ticking men off and saying, right, well, we know it's not you, But yeah, what a absolutely horrible card to have to carry about in your wallet that says, "I am not Bible John." So, over 200 officers are put onto the case. Interviews are taken with the Barrowland Ballroom staff, with guests. There are door-to-door calls around each of the victims' area. There's posters. There's news campaign. There are men questioned all over Glasgow police stations. Sex workers are interviewed in case anyone has ever encountered him. And yet, no one is arrested. The killings suddenly stop. Some of the theories around why they stop is that possibly Bible John had died. Maybe he had emigrated. Maybe he was a part of the army. Maybe he was in the police and it was all being covered up. None of these theories have any real grounding. Lots of investigation into all of these things, but none of them have ever actually been solid enough to say this is why the killings stopped. So, the hunt for Bible John continues. The trail goes cold, but the interest in the story never dies. People want justice for Patricia, Jemima, and Helen. I mean, so do I. I would like justice for those 3 women. I would like justice, to happen so that we know what happened. So the story could end here. But it doesn't. It gets way weirder. It gets weirder and more horrible. We'll pause for a second on Bible John, on those murders, and we'll look to an absolute monster of a man. A beast. A fucking beast called Peter Tobin.
A sexual sadist. This is a psychopath. This is a sexual sadist we've been dealing with. We've been dealing with a sexual sadist.
Peter Tobin is a Scottish convicted serial killer who for more than 40 years travelled around the UK living in various different parts and using different names. During this time, he murdered several women. Now, he boasts in prison that he's killed 48 women, but we don't really know if that's actually true. So a detective in the case of Peter Tobin said, "I understand he himself has laid claim to a large number. There's all sorts of numbers being bandied about, but they're all hypothetical. Boasts like this are just part of the ego of serial killers. Once they are caught, they've lost most of their control over their situation, but they need to have the feeling that I am actually really omnipotent." On one hand, he does not own up to the murders that he's actually done. On the other hand, he says, "I've done so many hundreds of killings," and he says it in an almost grandiose kind of way. He says serial killers or psychopaths at this level are almost like small children who make incredible boasts about how powerful they are or how much they have done. Like they will say, "I've got hundreds of marbles and hundreds of sweeties." I love that. Hundreds of sweeties. The problem with a psychopath is that they tend to be stuck at the cognitive and psychological level of a 3 or 4-year-old. They don't mature past that egocentric. They don't mature past that egocentric, self-censored. They don't mature past that egocentric, self-centered, narcissistic, all-powerful stage. They don't mature past that egocentric, self-centered, narcissistic, all-powerful stage when they don't feel they are to blame for anything. Now, we don't know how many people Peter Tobin may have killed, but there are cases that we absolutely do know about. In 1993, Peter Tobin was living alone in Hampshire in England. So this is 23 years after the Bible John murders. In his house in Hampshire, he carries out a brutal attack on 2 14-year-old girls. It's just horrible. After enticing them into his house in Hampshire, he drugs and he rapes them. He stabs one of the girls when a struggle breaks out. Good on you, girls. Good fucking on you for fighting them. Good on you for struggling with them. So, in the struggle and in the panic of the 2 girls trying to fight back, well done, he panics and he leaves the scene. But before he does so, he turns the gas on in the house, hoping that the gas fumes will kill them. That just makes me feel sick. What a fucking dickhead of a man. What an absolute prick. So he goes on the run and he hides out in Coventry, Brighton and London. Now, what he wasn't bargaining on is that both girls, they survive the attack. Thank God. They can also identify him, so he is tracked down and he is arrested. Good work. I'm glad the girls made it and I'm glad that he could be arrested. He pleads guilty to the attacks and he spends 10 years in prison in England. 10 years doesn't really seem enough for a crime like that. To entice 2 girls into your house, rape them, stab one of them and then try to fucking kill them. You get 10 years. Fuck off. That's ridiculous. So after being released in 2004, he is 58 years old and he returns to Scotland, where he's actually from, and he settles in Paisley. Now Paisley, interestingly, is actually where I am from. It's just outside of Glasgow. It's not too far away. Yeah, so good to know I share that with one of the worst serial killers in the UK. Great. So while living in Paisley, he couldn't afford his rent payments, and as a result, he became homeless. In 2006, he begins visiting a soup kitchen held at St Patrick's Roman Catholic Church in Anderston, in Glasgow. So during this time, he proves himself to be quite useful as a handyman in the church. Now, he's operating under an entirely false name. So since he's come out of prison, he's operating under the name Pat McLaughlin. You couldn't get more Scottish than that. Pat McLaughlin. And while doing these handyman jobs and earning a little cash, he meets 23-year-old Polish student Angelika Kluk. Now, Angelika was living at the time in a house that was sort of joined on to the church where he was being the handyman. So there's like a couple of houses just attached to it. There's a few different people living in this building, and as a student, that's where she stayed. Shortly after meeting Angelika, she vanishes. She one day just doesn't return to her house. So people who were friends with her, people who knew her from the church, they report her missing. They become really alarmed at her disappearance. So this makes the news that she's vanished. This girl has just up and disappeared. Did she go back to Poland? What's happened to her? 5 days later, her battered body was found under the floorboards of the St Patrick's Church. The last time Angelika had been seen was in the company of Peter Tobin. Tobin had at this point fled the area, but police tracked him down, and with overwhelming forensic evidence, he was convicted of her murder. He received a life sentence with a recommendation he serve a minimum of 21 years. Poor Angelika Kluk, she had died a brutal death. She'd been beaten, she'd been raped, she'd been tied up, and she'd been stabbed 19 times before being dumped underneath those floorboards. I think this, for me, is the worst bit of it. Forensic scientists indicated she'd been alive when she was placed in that space under the floorboards. Yeah, I'm just going to leave that there because it's just horrible. Psychologists and criminology experts looked at the murder of Angelika and determined this can't have been Peter Tobin's first murder. It was too detailed. It was too brutal. They worked out that Tobin may have developed his method of murder or begun understanding how he wanted to kill someone around the age of 19 or 20. So, at this point, he's nearly 60 years old, and police begin working on the assumption that he could have killed 40 years ago, and he could have been killing ever since. So to just zoom out for 1 wee second, if we just look at this, Tobin's crimes so far are the 2 girls that he tried to gas to death in his house, and Angelika Kluk's murder. Police launch something called Operation Anagram. Now, this is set up to examine Peter Tobin's past, and it's set up by Detective Superintendent David Swindle. Now, I love how this guy gets described. It's brilliant. He gets described by his colleague as, this guy is a real fucking detective. That's actually like watching a documentary about it. One of the policemen is so in awe of how David Swindle handled this case that he says he's a real fucking detective. But you know, I agree with this man, because what this operation uncovers, it's just amazing police work. So Detective Superintendent David Swindle, the great fucking detective, he really does a brilliant job here. They decide to look at Peter Tobin's movements throughout the past 40 years. They look at his history and they start to compare it with lots of unsolved murders across the UK. Part of the investigation leads them to his old address in one of his former homes in England, and they discover in the back garden the remains of 2 female bodies, 2 teenagers. These murders had been committed years earlier and they had never been solved. So what was happening was Tobin was moving around the UK, he was changing his name, he was living briefly in one area and then he was moving on to the next. So the first one that they looked at was the disappearance of a 15-year-old schoolgirl called Vicky Hamilton, and this happened in 1991. Vicky had been living in Bathgate, which, if you don't know the geography, it's just slightly outside of Edinburgh. It's where Susan Boyle is from, actually, interestingly. It's in West Lothian. So Vicky had been waiting for a bus and she vanished. She was never found again. Peter Tobin at the time was living just a mile away from where she vanished. Neighbours say that at the time they remember Tobin, he was working under a false name. I don't know what the hell name he was using at that point, but he wasn't Tobin. He had moved away from Bathgate in the days after her disappearance. And in a conversation with a neighbour, he'd said, "Oh, I'm moving to Margate." Now, if you don't understand or know the UK geography, that's pretty far. It's just short, I think, of about 500 miles. Now, that involves moving from the east area of Scotland near Edinburgh down to Margate, which is pretty close to London. So a big distance to move. So he leaves a couple of days after Vicky Hamilton has disappeared. When the police learn this information as part of Operation Anagram, they launch a search of both of those houses that he lived in. The one in Bathgate, from where she vanished, and the one he moved to in Margate. And when they get to the Margate house, they found the remains of Vicky in his back garden. This is the creepiest fucking bit of it for me. He had killed her in Bathgate and travelled 500 miles with the remains of her body to bury them in Margate. What a sick bastard. That is so vile. It actually, yeah, the killing of her is the fucking worst bit of it. But the fact that he actually took her remains 500 miles across the country to bury her in his back door in his wee house in Margate is just, ugh, it's awful. So the knife that he'd used to kill Vicky was also found alongside her remains, and this just linked him directly to the murder. It had his fingerprints all over it. He was charged and given a second life sentence. So at this point, he's already in prison for the murder of Angelica Kluck, and he's now has a second life sentence placed against him. And the judge said, "Yet again, you have shown yourself to be unfit to live in a decent society. It is hard for me to convey the loathing and revulsion that ordinary people will feel for what you have done. I am taking into consideration any risk that you may pose to the future public. Your crimes must rank amongst the most evil and most horrific acts that any human being could commit." The next victim to be unearthed was Dinah McNichol. She was 18 years old, and in August 1991, she was hitchhiking back from a music festival when she disappeared. It was in 2007, under Operation Anagram, that in that same garden where they found Vicky Hamilton's remains, they also found the remains of Dinah McNichol. So in the post-mortem, they realised that they both had traces of the drug amitriptyline in their system, and this was the same thing that Tobin had used years before on the 2 girls when he tried to gas them in his house. So, already in prison on a life sentence for Angelica, he was now given 2 more life sentences for Vicky and for Dinah, with a recommendation that Peter Tobin should never be released. Good. Thank fucking God. What a monster. So, what brings the 2 stories together? Well, the theory is this. Police are working under the theory that actually Peter Tobin was Bible John. Peter Tobin was in the Glasgow area at the time of the Bible John murders and was known to be a regular attendee at the Barrowland Ballroom where all three of the victims had met their killer. They use these facts to make their case. For a brief time in his youth, Peter Tobin was married. Where did he meet his wife? He met her in the Barrowlands Ballroom, and it was around the time of the three murders. He was at the right age when he was attending the ballroom. Photographs of a young Peter Tobin are strikingly similar to the artist's impression of Bible John. It is chilling how much they look alike. Honestly, you'll find this online if you look for it. The photo fit of Bible John and the young Peter Tobin, they've got the same face. It's just exactly the same person. So Tobin refuses to cooperate with police on this. He will neither admit nor deny if he's Bible John, if he committed these murders. Now, he's happy to walk about prison like a dickhead, boasting, oh, I've killed this person, that person, and that person, but will never sit down with police and actually say, yes, okay, I am Bible John. Yes, I did kill those women from the Barrowlands Ballroom. It's just really, there's so many things about his story that are just, I just can't even believe the man was married. He was married for a long time. Yeah, and this, I'm just going to play you this tiny little bit of audio. This is from his wife.
There are thousands of battered wives, and that's all I thought I was. I thought I was just in the category of that. I had absolutely no idea he had any ill thoughts towards anyone else at all. Didn't have ill thoughts towards my son. He played with him beautifully. No way in a million years I could have had any idea at all that he could have done these things. I had no idea.
So during the re-investigation of all of his crimes under the Operation Anagram, there's a woman called Patricia Chambers. She comes forward and she tells police that at the time of the Barrowland murders, she was frequently there on a Saturday night. That was her Saturday night out in the town. And one night she was there and she believes that she was talking to a guy who spiked her drink. This guy then later dragged her up an alley and he raped her, but she managed to get away. Now, she never went to the police. Always go to the police, please. I'm not preaching at people. I'm not telling you how to live your life, but please, if somebody does anything like that to you, please go to the police. Don't let anybody ever get away with any fucking shit like that. Anyway, for years and years and years and years and years, she did nothing about it. That was just something that had happened when she was a teenager. She wasn't really thinking about it. It was way back in her memory. She'd moved on with her life. She got married. She'd had kids. Fine. And then when the murder of Angelica Kluck happened, she saw Peter Tobin's face on TV. Now, it had been 40 years, but she immediately recognised his eyes. She recognised his face straight away, and she said, that's the man that raped me near the Barrowlands. So, it's a fact that Peter Tobin was in those dance halls when those girls were taken and killed. What an absolute piece of shit. What an absolute monster of a man. So does all of this tie up the story nicely? Well, there's of course divided opinion. Serial killer experts will say, of course he's Bible John. There's way too many coincidences for it not to be true. But others will say, and this is interesting, I sort of took a wee path down this road when I was doing some research. Others will say, well, we don't even know if there was one Bible John in the 1960s. Police just said, there's been 3 deaths. We think it's the same man. What if it was 3 different killers? For me, I don't know. The 3 deaths of the women in the 60s are very similar. They're all killed in the exact same way. They're all killed so identically that for it to be 3 different men, I don't know. That's a stretch. Anyway, the speculation around this will never go away. People want to know who was Bible John. We know who Peter Tobin was. We know who he is. He's just a cunt of a man who should die in prison. But Bible John, are they the same? Are they not? I'd like to think that they are. I went into researching this and looking at this story thinking, I'm not sure that I think Peter Tobin's actually Bible John. And I've come out the other side of it and now I'm absolutely convinced that he is. But I would love to know if you disagree. I'd love to know what your thoughts on it are. Okay, and so ends the story of Bible John and Peter Tobin. Okay, so what do I find interesting about this case? Well, the span of time, the fact that we're talking about deaths that happened in the 60s and now we're talking about deaths that happened in the 90s, and yeah, just that huge span of time. And is he the same man? I suppose also the closeness of it to me, I think that's interesting that it happened near me. I just think that want to know, is he Bible John? Is he? I don't know. This one absolutely fascinates me. I always say, I pick a story because it stays with me. So, yeah, this one does stay with me, and I just don't know if I'll ever know the answer. What do you think? I hope you enjoyed this story. Okay, as usual, if you want to get in touch, you can. You can find me on Instagram and on Facebook. It's just Extraordinary Stories Podcast. At Twitter, it's at Extra Stories Pod. Thank you. When I asked last week for some iTunes reviews, I got a lot, so thank you very much. If you haven't left me an iTunes review, it would be really nice if you did that. It just really helps. There's a whole load of amazing true crime podcasts out there, and they all cover some absolutely wonderful stories. But if there's a story that you think, yeah, I should be covering, or I should know about, or I should be looking at, please let me know. And I guess finally, if you're in Glasgow, go and give the Barras a visit. I absolutely guarantee you will love it. Alright, thanks so much for listening. Okay, goodbye.
It didn't affect me really one way or the other. I would imagine from the look on his face, let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over. Let's get it on, let's do it, let's get it over.